by Rob Marshall, the director of Into the Woods. Rob, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Robbie.
I want to ask you first of all about your first encounter with Into the Woods, the Sondheim musical.
I saw the original production on Broadway in 1987. I was, I guess, in my late 20s, and I loved it, but now have since, over the years, learned to see it in a different way. When I saw it in 1987, I loved the joy of the piece, I loved the originality of the piece. I loved immediately what it said about parents and children and the consequences of wishes. And I felt all that when I first saw it. I thought, this is amazing, this is all in one piece.
Did it strike you originally as something that should be made into a film?
When I looked at the first opening number, the prologue it's called, which in our film is about 16 minutes long, I thought it was very cinematic. Even just how it's written, because you're
cross-cutting between all the stories.
Exactly,
right?
You're introducing all these stories, but you're moving back and forth with them back and forth like in a very cinematic way. It's actually more complicated to do on stage because of that. You know, you're in all these different places, but in film, I thought that's so perfect for the rhythm, and that sort of sets the rules for the piece. That says this is how we're going to tell this story, and then you sort of follow that throughout.
This was a project that took a very long time to actually get it into production, right? I mean, Into the Woods had been, a film version of the musical had been planned for
yes,
what, 10,
there was one in the 90s.
So?
There was one in the 90s they were talking about doing, I know the cast like Billy Crystal and Goldie Hawn, and I think they talked about doing it with Muppets at one time too, or even animated, because, you know, musicals kind of went out of fashion. You know, when I did Chicago, for instance, it was such a dead genre at that time. I mean, people really said this isn't going to work. I remember hearing that over and over again. And so it was very kind of fortunate when Chicago did what it did. After Chicago opened, I sat down with Stephen Sondheim because I really wanted to do a musical of his for film. And we talked about all kinds of different ideas. And he said to me, this was 12 years ago, I think Into the Woods would be great for you. I don't know why I said that. I mean, I know what I loved about it, but that stayed with me.
You know who has seen Into the Woods, because the minute you mention the title to them, they always come back with Into the Woods, and launch into that opening number.
I know, people know that so well. I think it's been done a lot, certainly in America, in schools too.
Right.
It's been done a lot, or you have a friend who's been in it, or you've been in it yourself, or so. You know, people have a real connection to it. I love that.
When you're putting together a cast like this as well, I mean, people like Meryl Streep and Johnny Depp, obviously Johnny Depp, since discussions for this film had started in the early days, he had then played Sweeney Todd in Tim Burton's version of that, so he has some kind of Sondheim pedigree.
Yes.
But the rest of the cast, you know, they're not necessarily people we would associate with musical theatre. Emily Blunt, who's just flat out tremendous in this film, just wonderful, one of the best things she's ever done. But you know, so how do you go about assembling that, and particularly with James Corden? You know, what was it about him? Did you see him in One Man, Two Governors, or one of his TV programs that made you think he was right for the part?
I saw him in One Man, Two Governors in New York, and I thought he was brilliant. You know, the baker is a very complicated part, and it's actually the central character of the film. And it needs to be someone that you take the journey with. The baker and his wife are really us. They represent us. So the fact that he wasn't well known was great for me. The fact that we could sort of just follow the journey with him through his character was really special, and not see him as an actor we knew. You need a great deal of range to play that part, because you need to be very funny and physically funny, but also you need to be incredibly deep and moving and vulnerable and can sing, you know, and James could do all these things. I learned that when we did a reading of the piece a year before we started filming. I did a reading, and, you know, the Disney folk saw him in it and thought he was brilliant, which he was. And I was thrilled, because I really wanted to cast a combination of theater and film actors, and mostly just cast the best people for the roles. That's what I looked to do, and that happened with Emily Blunt too. Something
that's particularly tricky with the Sondheim material as well is there's a lot of mischief in it, and a lot of real danger too.
Yes.
And the character of, I mean, Big Bad Wolf, Johnny Depp, you know, a perfect match, but then you have him, you know, looking at Red Riding Hood in some slightly suspect ways, and that must have made that role quite difficult to cast, because you don't want her to be too old, but you also don't want her to be too young and just be totally sinister.
Well, the great thing about Johnny is that he can play something like that in a very playful way. You know, that's what he brings to his roles. There's not a threatening quality to him. He always has like a little bit of a joy to his work, a playfulness, a fun. He's a really character or actor in a leading man's body. You know, that's what he brings to Jack Sparrow, that And I experienced that with him when I directed in Pirates. And in that way, it's safer because there are innuendos, but he knows how to play with them and make them not so dark that it becomes too creepy.
Were Disney at all nervous about the darker elements of the film?
I think they were actually excited about it because they were interested in expanding the definition of what a modern fairy tale could be. That was impressive, I have to say, and I feel that's been happening with their company. Maleficent certainly did that, saw that Sleeping Beauty from a different angle. Even Frozen, the love story is about two sisters and not the classic man and woman kind of thing. So I kind of think, you know, they're moving forward into the 21st century, which I think is important. And I think this speaks to a modern audience because it reveals what happens after Happily Ever After, as you know.
One of the things that I thought was really fascinating about the making of this film is that the budget that you had, despite having this enormous cast and it being a huge production, the budget was not really much more than you had for Chicago 15 years ago.
I know, isn't that crazy?
It lends a kind of a real, because you were using locations rather than green screen and physical sets, was there something that having that kind of tight budget helped with at all?
I think it does in a funny way. You know, musicals are still a risk, so I think, you know, especially a Sondheim musical, so I think they wanted to make sure we were, you know, smart about how we did that. And it was frustrating a little bit because, you know, you didn't have all the tools, but it forces you to be creative in a way. I know that we were designing in a very sort of responsible way, doing a lot of location work as much as we could, but I like that for the film because in a way I think it's good for the actor to be in a real place, sort of not in a souped up kind of crazy green screen world. I think you believe these people. I think you care about them and root for them and follow their stories, and that came about because of the fact that we had a limited time and budget.
Are you familiar at all with the British tradition of pantomime? Because
yes.
It's something that's not such a thing in America at all, right? But the idea of taking a well-loved story and subverting it and doing new things with it.
That's true. I saw Cinderella at the Palladium in 1971. Oh my gosh, I loved it so much. I thought it was so irreverent and funny. Of course, men dressing up as women, that's like a real tradition, I think, in pantomime. But like vaudeville almost. And very much, I think, it's fun, I never thought about that, but very much, in a way, a part of the Into the Woods kind of thing.
You mentioned earlier about the fact that musicals really fell out of fashion, and for a very long time, I mean, it was probably about 30 years, they were
That's true.
Just not really touched by anyone, apart from Disney, who are, of course, able to put on these big animated spectaculars, but really live-action musicals. And why do you think that was?
There were a lot of ones that didn't work. And when they don't work, because they're kind of big, they really don't work. You know, I mean, a few actually sunk a few studios for a while. So, and that scares people. And then more sort of realistic cinema came into fashion in the late 60s, early 70s. So they started to seem kind of, I don't know, cliche or something, musicals. I never feel it's the genre that dies. I feel it's sort of maybe in a way how they're done, and I feel you just have to kind of move with the times and make sure that you honor the tradition of what it is, but also reinvent it as well. You can't just let it sit on what it was. And you know, the thing about musicals, it's that famous saying that it only works when the words aren't enough, so you have to sing, so it feels organic. And when it doesn't, when you're watching a movie and you have that little moment where they start to sing and it feels uncomfortable, it's because it hasn't been earned that way. So that's something that you have to really work hard to get. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time. It's very hard.
What do you think the tipping point was? Because, you know, Chicago and Moulin Rouge were really the two that kind of brought it back as a force to be reckoned with.
Right. We were heading into war at the time of Chicago, and I think people needed that escapism as well. So I think that might have helped in some way. But I also think that because of the animated musicals, people, you know, Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, and you know, that helped usher in a new time, and it was just waiting for a good musical, a good piece. You know, Chicago is a beautifully written piece. We did it on a small budget, and everybody cut their prices to make it work. I couldn't have been more surprised and happy as to what happened with it. That was the thrilling.